morning, everyone. If we could get your attention. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Brenda Nicodemus, and I'm a professor in the Department of Interpretation here at Gallaudet University. And I'm also the director for a center that was recently renamed Center for Advancement of Interpreting and Translation Research. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here today for this lecture with Dr. Kim Brown-Kurtz. This particular lecture series is supported by the Department of Interpretation, CATER, and the GURIEC. And someone will be talking more about GUREC in a minute. This lecture series happens on an annual basis, and the intent is to promote discussion and to foster ideas about what is happening currently with interpreting research and education. We have 4 different lectures that will be happening this year, and I wanted you to know a little bit more about them so that you can mark your calendars with those particular dates. After today, the next lecture will be on October 24th with Dr. Keith Cagle. And you may think that American Sign Language is an actual new, young language, but he'll be talking about the signs that are thousands of years old. So it'll be quite an exciting lecture, so make sure that you are available for that one. The next one will be on February 20th. We will have Melissa Smith from California joining us to talk about possibilities and pitfalls of educational interpreting. And that really fits with the topic that we have for today. And then last, we have one of our own faculty members, Danielle Hunt, who has quite a fascinating study that she's researching related to professional identity development of interpreters. And so she'll be telling us a little bit more about that and what that all means. So these lectures are open and free to attend, open to the public, and that's one of the benefits that we have working here at Gallaudet. We have extensive faculty here as a part of the university, students, and we want to be able to share all this information with you all and the rest of the world. So we have a small audience here in this room, about 35 people, but we are currently streaming this to about 400 people all over the world. So I want to say hello to all of those of you who are joining us from Alabama, joining us from New York, and Hawaii. We're actually jealous that you're all there and that we're here. And for those people who are in Newark as well, so welcome to Gallaudet. And feel free to visit our department, and we look forward to meeting with you in future events. So for those people who are attending today, you can earn RID CEUs. You'll have to register for those, and there's a pre- and post-test that you'll have to take in order to get CEUs. I think this is a great way for you all to continue with your professional development and to earn CEUs while learning about new topics. We'd also like to thank the interpreters that we have today. First, Kari Ball, and we have Valerie Sultan. So I would like to thank the two of you for your work today. Next, I'd like to introduce Beverly Hallra, who is the director of the GURIEC, and she'll be sharing a few comments. So, Bev?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Beverly Hallra, and I almost got promoted to doctor. I just saw that. Just Beverly Hallra. Shoot! That doctor's status didn't last very long. Anyway, I'm the director of the Gallaudet University Regional Interpreter Education Center, which is abbreviated as GURIEC. I would like to welcome all of you here today. GURIEC is part of the Department of Interpretation. We receive grants and funding from the RSA Department of Education, and we use those funds to help sponsor events like this particular colloquium series in particular. And so we are thrilled to do that in partnership with Cater as well as the Department of Interpretation. Our goal through that grant is to increase and promote the numbers of interpreters and also improve the skills and the quality of interpreters around the country. Part of that is through lecture series such as this. So I'd like to encourage everyone to get their CEUs. GURIAC sponsors the CEUs. And Brenda Nicodemus, I almost gave you a demotion. I forgot to say Dr. Brenda Nicodemus already mentioned the CEUs that you can get here today. If you are watching us through live streaming, you are also able to do CEUs through Pinrez. Anyway, I would like to welcome Dr. Kim Kurtz here, and I hope that you enjoy yourselves.
Thank you, Bev. I wanted to mention one special guest who's joining us today, and that is the Dean of the Arts and Sciences, Dr. Jeannie Gertz. So thank you for being here, Dr. Gertz. And lastly, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who will be introducing the guest speaker for our topic today, Dr. Keith Cagle, who works for the Department of Interpretation and is a good friend of Kim, I believe. So he was very eager to be able to introduce her today. So, Dr. Cagle. Good morning, everyone. This is a huge honor for me to be able to introduce one of my old friends, Dr. Kim Kurtz. And I've known her for probably 24, 25 years now. I first met her when I was working at NTID. I also know her as Kim Brown, her maiden name, and she was a strong leader at NTID. She eventually married Dr. Chris Kurtz, who is a good friend of mine, and they have 4 lovely sons. The youngest is 8 and the oldest is 15. She went to the University of Kansas to get her PhD in education. And since then, she's been involved in several different projects, several different organizations, and I'd like to mention some of the highlights of the ones that she's been involved with and how that's had an impact here in America as well as Canada. When she was at NTID, she worked with the New York State Department of Education to develop outcomes, learning outcomes for ASL 1 through 4, and that's really where I started to work with her in a professional capacity. She's also involved with the American Sign Language Teacher Association. She was also involved with completing the national standards in May of 2013 in Washington State. And I'm very impressed with her knowledge and her leadership. And working with the American Council Foreign Language Teaching. And there's certain criteria and standards there that she had worked on. So very impressed with the work that she's done thus far. For the past 5 years, she's been working as the chair of the Department of ASL and Interpretation in NTID, running the American Sign Language and Interpretation program with 25 full-time staff, or faculty and staff, as well as 160 students. So I can't even imagine your life there. I'm sure that you're such a busy woman. So we'd like to thank her for giving up her time to be here to present to us about her research. And her research is looking at direct instruction versus interpreted instruction as it relates to deaf students. So I'm very eager to learn more about what it is that you found. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kim Kurtz.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Keith for that wonderful introduction. It's so nice to see an old friend again. and to be able to continue our professional relationship as well. Hello, I would like to thank the Department of Interpretation for inviting me to come and present today at this colloquium. I'm honored to be here. It's always good to be back at Gallaudet's campus. My topic today is going to be focusing on my research with deaf students' understanding of direct sign communication and interpreted instruction. I'm going to provide research that shows how deaf students operate in those two different situations. These pictures that you see here are folks that I would like to thank for helping me with my studies that I've done over the past years. They've helped me to talk about what the meaning of my research is and the possible impacts, and I could not have done it without their support. This is the agenda for today's talk. I'll give you a bit of a lit review as it relates to educational interpreting and mainstream education over the years. I will then talk about my two studies, the first study having to do with testing deaf students' understanding level, and then the second study is interviews with deaf students and regarding their experience in interpreted education. So that's what I will be talking about today. As you know, back in the 70s, they started to establish new special education laws. Section 504 of the Rehab Act came out in 1972. They are going to soon reestablish some of these laws. I'm not going to go into depth with each of these laws because we don't have time. That would be a completely other lesson. But what's key about these laws is that they led to the establishment of what is called reasonable accommodation in mainstream situations, in mainstream education. I would like to begin by talking about Amy Raleigh. Back in the 1970s, she was a deaf student who was going to school. Her parents were deaf, and her parents fought time and again to demand that the school provide interpreters, but the school refused to do so. They fought this case in courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the U.S. Supreme Court, her case became the first IDEA law-related case. Unfortunately, she lost in the Supreme Court because she was able to receive good grades throughout her schooling. She was an A student. But what had happened is that her mother was a teacher, and so after she was finished with schooling, she would come home and her mother would tutor her on all of the different subjects that she was learning about in school that day, and that's why she was able to get good grades. But the court stated that clearly if she was able to receive good grades, she did not need interpreted instruction. Because of that loss, the NAD, the National Association for the Deaf, decided to become more involved with fighting for the rights for deaf children. And this was back in the 1970s when people started to question what it was that we know about education in mainstream situations and what happens with deaf children in mainstream education. This is a picture of deaf education today. 68% of our deaf children today go to hearing schools and mainstream programs. 22% are at deaf schools, and the other 10% might be something like homeschooling or some other type of schooling that isn't one of the other, isn't either mainstream or a deaf school. But this gives you a brief snapshot of what's going on in education today for deaf students. Now, this, too, is research from Gallaudet Research Institute. We have 58% of our students that are mainstreamed. 26% are in self-contained classrooms, which means that it's a classroom for deaf children, but it's situated at a public school. 16% use what is referred to as a resource room, which means that they might be in a mainstream program with an interpreter, or some other kind of accommodation, and then they go to the resource room to receive additional instruction, tutoring, assistance with their homework, and their assignments. This bar graph talks about the types of interpreting in the different mainstream sites. Here you'll see 14% provide sign language interpreting, either through ASL or contact sign. The other types of interpreting are indicated below. You'll see oral transliteration, cued speech, transliteration, and deaf-blind interpreting. There's a key term in education called mediated, and what that is that the information is provided in an indirect way through a secondary source or a third party. And that is the term that's used often in the special education field, mediated instruction or mediated education. And in my research, I use that term to indicate that you have a teacher with an interpreter, and that interpreter is an intermediary between the teacher and the student. In the 70s, I was talking about the different laws that were established. And at that point, people started to discuss what kinds of information we have about educational interpreting in general. One of the earliest pioneering research was by Larry Fleischer, who wanted to study deaf children and their understanding of the interpreted communication, whether it was in ASL or whether it was transliterated. And transliterated I'm referring to as a word-for-words signing system. And what he found was that the students were able to understand the ASL interpretation far better than the transliterated one. There was also another study by Marshark et al., who, and this was one of the earliest research as far as what's happening in our school system. Your university president, Dr. Alan Hurwitz, was one of the earlier researchers in the field of deaf education. And as I mentioned, we were talking about deaf students' understanding of ASL interpretation versus transliteration, but Hurwitz took the opposite perspective. He wanted to know whether educational interpreters could understand the ASL provided by students or the contact signing provided by students, and he found that interpreters were better able to understand the contact sign as opposed to the ASL. And Hurwitz was actually very much involved in the educational interpreter task force that took place in the 80s. Now what's interesting is that in Marshark's study, which took place at RIT in a classroom there was an instructor and then an interpreter. And Marshark wanted to study the comparison between the deaf students and the hearing students and their comprehension of the content that was provided in the classroom. So after the lecture was completed, he passed out an exam regarding the content that had just been provided in that classroom, and found that the hearing students seemed to have understood 87% of the information, whereas the deaf students in the class only had access to about 59%, or understood 59% of the content that was provided in the classroom. And so we see that deaf students are missing a lot of the information that is provided in those instructional settings. There was another case study that was done just very recently in 2012 by Wolbers. In that study, they researched third grade students and also the interpreter in that classroom with those third grade students. And they found that on average, interpreters are only following what the teacher is saying about 33% of the time. 66% of the time, the interpreters are either eliminating or elaborating on what the teacher is saying. So essentially they're stepping out of their role of interpreter and becoming more of a tutor or instructional assistant or teacher. And that's a fairly commonplace among educational interpreters. And so there is a lot of confusion about roles and responsibilities when it comes to educational interpreting. Those early studies led to the knowledge and the language that we use, but we also wanted to look at the interaction among deaf students and their hearing peers. Keating and Miras developed a study where they looked at deaf students and hearing students and their peer interactions. And they found that deaf with deaf and hearing with hearing interactions were far better than those among deaf and hearing heterogeneous groups. Mindy Hopper, who is from the University of Rochester, actually just completed her dissertation, and she was studying the theory of incidental learning, which I'm going to abbreviate as IL. We know about learning that takes place in the classroom, but what about the learning that takes place during recess, in hallways, in the cafeteria, at lunchtime, via interaction? And there's a great deal of research that shows, like for example with Vygotsky, his theory having to do with the zone of proximal development, which showed that children in their playing situations will scaffold their language and thus develop stronger language skills. And Hopper wanted to see what kinds of incidental learning was happening with deaf students as opposed to hearing students. And she found that there was a statistically significant difference in exposure to incidental learning versus a lack of exposure to incidental learning in deaf and hearing students. So that was a brief lit review of different research and articles having to do with educational interpreting. There's a great deal out there, and I just wanted to select some that applied to my discussion today. But I would like to talk about educational interpreting and the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment, the EIPA. How many of you are familiar with the EIPA? The EIPA is a tool, an assessment tool, used to measure interpreters and their skill working in K-12 environments. So it assesses their language skill, their knowledge base. So the EIPA is a metric, and it was established by Dr. Brenda Schick, who is currently teaching at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and also Kevin Williams, who is currently a faculty member in my department at RIT. Both of them together developed this EIPA for the educational interpreting audience. Now what's interesting is if you would like more information on the EIPA, you can actually look at this website that I've provided here on my PowerPoint, and that will give you a plethora of information about this particular assessment. The EIPA is now used in more than 35 states across the country. It is worth noting that it's not used in all 50 states. For example, my state, New York, has yet to use the EIPA, which I think is quite ironic given that New York is usually on the frontier leading the field, but clearly they're not doing so with the EIPA. And I believe Maryland is another state that does not have it. I will show you a breakdown of which states do have it. Now the EIPA is, they have about 23,000 different data points, different interpreters that they've assessed. And this talks about the skill levels of the different cohorts of EIPA. So we have a 4.5 level, which means that they understand about 85 to 90% of the information, and that 85 to 90% of the information will be passed on to the deaf student from the hearing teacher. The lower you go in your point scale for the EIPA, the less information is actually transmitted to the student. More than 50% of our educational interpreters have less than a 3.0 EPA level today, which is a clear indicator that we're in an emergency situation. We have interpreters with less skill than they need in our educational settings. This research was done by Schick in 2009, and it's a state-by-state analysis, providing the average EIPA score for each state. The highest skill level is in Michigan, which I thought was quite interesting. The lowest EIPA skill level is in West Virginia. So again, not all 50 states have adopted the EIPA. So this just gives you a brief concept of, or a brief understanding of the skill level for the average EIPA interpreter in the different states. Now my understanding is that in Colorado, they are going to actually become the first state to mandate that all educational interpreters have a 4.0 skill level or higher on the EIPA, whereas many other states only have a 3.0. We still have a long way to go. This is another study. The hypothesis was established to compare students that go through an ITP program with an associate's degree and how they compare with those who are in four-year programs. Now the assumption was that students who decided to continue their education and go through a four-year program you would see an increase in their EIPA scores. But the results indicated that that was not the case. There was a small increase, but not a very significant one. So even 2 additional years of interpreting study and coursework did not lead to a significant increase in their EIPA scores. Perhaps it's because those programs don't have enough courses with content. It's really unknown. There are many factors that could actually contribute to the fact that we don't see a significant increase between associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees in interpreting. If you compare students who went through an interpreter training program or an interpreter preparation program with those who have not done so, you'll see that their scores did show a bit of a difference, but even with 2 additional years, their EIPA skill level only had a minimal increase. For the next portion of this talk, I'd like to talk about my first study, where I looked at 19 different children. When I talked about my lit review, most of those research studies were actually done for college-age students, not K through 12. And when I discovered that that was the case, I decided I wanted to go into the K-12 system, and I developed this study in order to do so. I had 19 subjects in my study. Half were male, half were female. And in that body of subjects, half of them were native signers who were exposed to signing because their parents were deaf, and the other half of the subjects had late exposure to signing and their parents were hearing. And I wanted to compare those two groups. My 19 subjects' ages ranged from 11 to 15 years old. The reason that I selected middle school aged students was because As I said, much research dealt with college-age students, and I thought that high school was a little bit too close to college age and elementary was a little bit too young. And so I thought that a middle school would be a great age to study, and I also thought it was a fun age. And so that's why I selected that particular age group for my study. In my research, I visited 5 different schools. 2 of them were residential schools for the deaf. 1 was a day school for the deaf. It was a charter school. And then there were 2 public schools, which provided interpreted instruction. So I went into these different environments to assess how students were learning in those environments. Before I selected students for participation in this research, I did an assessment of their signing skill. Students who did not meet a certain signing skill level were not included as participants in this study. The reason that I did so was because I wanted to make sure that the students could access the language that was provided, because both the teacher and the interpreter were going to be utilizing ASL, American Sign Language. For my research, I decided to have the teachers present 6 different lessons, and they were science lessons. I had a great deal of debate with my research team about which types of lessons we would like to use. We realized that English lessons or reading and writing might be too frustrating for the deaf students. Math lessons had too much to do with numbers, and I didn't want to assess students' ability to understand numbers. So I thought that maybe we could use either history or science, and we decided to go ahead and use science lessons because we thought that students might have some sort of foundational knowledge about it, some intuitive knowledge, but they could also learn something new. I will now talk about what those 6 lessons were. The first had to do with conservation tillage, which deals with agriculture. Each of these lessons were about 7 to 10 minutes in length. So students would, it wouldn't be a prolonged lesson. It was brief enough for them to gather some information, and it was interesting information. So again, the first one has to do with conservation and how that relates to farming and agriculture. The second, well, you know, in Rochester, we have our winters. We're well known for our snow. I mean, sometimes as high as my mailbox. Typically in Rochester, if you're driving through Rochester, you'll see that they're planting trees along the roadside. And the reason that they do that is because they're trying to prevent the snow from actually blowing onto the streets. So they'll either have that orange fencing or trees. And that's what this lecture was about, was utilizing trees as a snow fence. The third lesson had to do with reef building corals and how reefs grow and develop in the ocean. The fourth one had to do with the formation of islands. The fifth was a lesson on forensic archaeology. So the archaeology of bones, etc., and artifacts. The sixth lesson focused on radioactive dating, looking at rocks. And as you know, the Earth's layers, the Earth has layers of different ages of rocks, and so they use radioactive dating to try and date what years the different rocks were existing. And they could even go back to the age of dinosaurs. So again, each of these was a brief lesson, about 7 to 10 minutes. In my study, I had 2 different conditions. The first was direct instruction with a teacher who was deaf, had a degree in deaf education, had a degree in the teaching of math and science. So that was the direct signed instruction. We also had a hearing instructor who had a degree in education as well as in the teaching of math and science. The 3 of us worked together to develop the lesson plans. based on their own experiences teaching for middle school students. The interpreter that I selected was a CODA, so she was a native signer. She had an EIPA score of 5.0, which is hard to find. Just as a side note, there are only about 200 educational interpreters throughout the country that have a 5.0 EIPA score. So I was very lucky to actually find this interpreter with a 5.0 score. And she also had her CICT certificate from RID. So my point being that she was a very skilled interpreter, very experienced in educational interpreting as well. And both of the teachers followed the exact same scripts when they were providing the lessons. And that gave me a bit more control so that I could reduce the number of variables in my study. Here I'd like to talk about my within-subject design. I had two patterns. The first pattern, we had pattern 1 and then pattern 2. In pattern 1, half of my students would watch the lessons 1, 3, and 5 out of that 6 that I just mentioned. So lessons 1, 3, and 5 would be provided in direct instruction. And then lessons 2, 4, and 6 would be interpreted. The other half of my subjects experienced their exposure to these lessons in the reverse. So 2, 4, and 6 would be direct instruction, and 1, 3, and 5 would be interpreted. And the reason that I did this was that it wouldn't be possible for me to have my subjects watch the same lesson both in direct and interpreted instruction, and so I decided to provide these two different patterns with a random sample. And they were randomly selected. So I started with this research question because people in the deaf community came up to me and asked me, what is the purpose of this? We already know the answer. But I wanted to show that we instinctually knew this answer, but we didn't have the research to back it up. I wanted documentation to actually prove what our instincts basically told us and what the actual difference was, and that led to my question. So the question was, do deaf students learn differently in direct communication and interpreted environments? And in which do they perform better? Before the lessons, I would provide pre-tests to the students. After taking these pre-tests, the students would watch the instruction, and then they would get post-tests. So I'm curious what you think as far as what happened. Was there any difference in the direct and interpreted communication?
Some say yes, some say no.
So my study did show that direct communication had a much greater benefit as compared to interpreted instruction. There was a much better understanding on the deaf students' part when they actually received the lesson via direct communication. Let me wait just a moment. The next research question I had was whether native signers, deaf of deaf students, how they would perform as compared to non-native signers, deaf of hearing students. So I'm curious what your thoughts might be. Well, let me show you how the results bore out in my study. I wanted to make sure that you had some time to actually see this bar graph and analyze it because it's quite significant. In summary, the native signing deaf students performed better in both the direct communication, direct instruction, and interpreted instruction environments. And this is as compared to the students who were non-native signers of ASL. The non-native students did worse in interpreted situations. So that shows that students who have late exposure to sign language actually do far better in direct communication, direct instruction. This was a repeated ANOVA measurement, and it showed that there was a statistically significant difference between these two groups and these two environments. Now, what's really interesting to note about experience with interpreters, essentially I wanted to find out whether or not students who had more experience with interpreters would actually have better understanding or increase their comprehension level. Like, for example, if there was a student who went to a mainstream program for 5 years and with an interpreter, and would they do better than someone who had only had a year of exposure with interpreters? And I found in my research that actually the years of experience with interpreters had no bearing whatsoever on the results. So in summary, my study showed that deaf children perform better in direct instruction environments. Oh, wait a moment, let me go back. My study showed that the best predictor of student performance and student success is their language skill, not the years of experience working with interpreters. It had to do with language skill alone. These are some of my theories with respect to native signing deaf children. Now again, they performed better than their non-native peers in both the interpreted situations and the direct situations. And I think that's because they have language acquisition that occurs in the home. They also have real-world knowledge. Deaf children are exposed to what is occurring in the real world. They see that via communication through their parents. Their parents can actually teach them about things that occur in the real world. So when they're with an interpreter, they have that content, that background knowledge. When you have a deaf student who's growing up with hearing parents, they have less exposure to that kind of learning or that kind of communication. My study also showed that native signing deaf students were able to adjust their own language skills in order to accommodate whomever it is that they're speaking with, whereas non-native children had less of an ability to do that. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the topics that were addressed in my interviews of students' perceptions of interpreted education. We have a great deal in our lit review of qualitative research, but from the interpreter's perspective, not from the deaf student's perspective. And so again, I wanted to get into a K-12 environment in that system, and I wanted to interview 20 deaf students about their own perspectives on interpreters and interpreted education. At this point, however, I didn't just stop at K through 12. I actually went all the way up the spectrum to post-secondary and graduate level students. I actually have a chapter in this book if you'd like more information about this particular study. I had 20 subjects. This is the breakdown of those subjects. The items that you see here in purple are the ones that I'm going to actually speak about briefly. I wanted to know about students' perspectives on interpreters in educational settings and their roles. Some of them perceive them as being tutors, note takers, teaching assistants, members of a support team, communication facilitators, and even here, friends. Some students perceived interpreters as being their friends. Who else were they going to be able to chat with, especially students who are the only student in a mainstream program or one of very few? And I thought that that was really telling as far as where interpreters are able to draw the line with respect to the students that they're working with. I'm going to let you go ahead and read this quote from a high school student. This quote talks about how younger students tend to be more reliant on their interpreters, and then as they grow older, they have more autonomy and independence. Younger children, I was trying to question these students about their self-reporting of their understanding of what interpreters are interpreting. Elementary school students would often report that they understood a great deal, whereas they became older. When I spoke with the older students, it seemed that they were more aware of what it was that they were missing when it came to interpreted instruction. You'll note here that the younger the student, the more they self-report their understanding of what the interpreter is interpreting. I asked students why it is that they thought that they were missing out this information. Some of them mentioned something related to cognitive load. Classrooms are complex situations. For example, you have a teacher who's standing, they're watching the interpreter, they're watching the teacher, they may be looking at a PowerPoint or a screen, they may be reading a book. There's a great deal that's coming in visually, and it can be quite challenging. So their cognitive load is much greater than a hearing student. They're working far harder to get that information. And they're realizing that they also have to themselves interpret what the interpreter is giving to them in order to make sure that they understand the information that's coming to them. This is another quote that I'd like you to read. This happens with a fair amount of frequency as well. Students are realizing that they're having to adjust their own signing to ensure that the interpreter understands them. This is a wish list for interpreters, a student's wish list of interpreters. I'm going to let you go ahead and read this on your own, but you can see what it is that students would like from their interpreters. This is a high school deaf student who said, actually, I would like to know what other hearing students are saying. And I don't have access to that, but then when I have my own side conversations, oh wow, sometimes the interpreter will voice that. I guess that I have to make sure that it's equal access either way. This was a quote from a middle school student. And this again has to deal with educational interpreters' boundaries, because educational interpreters are demanding attention from the middle school student, and the middle school student feels that they should have some autonomy with respect to how they are receiving the information. There is a great deal of variety. There's no formal standard assessment as far as effective learning environments for our deaf students. This was a very common theme with deaf students. They would say that interpreters often try to seek reassurance from the student, and the student ends up becoming somewhat like a sign language instructor. They would prefer to have access to interpreters who are already qualified and already confident in their skills. This has to do with word selection, word choice, and matching the language use. For this portion, I'd like to talk about the implications of my research. I had talked earlier about how 80% of our deaf students are in mainstream programs, 20% are in deaf schools, and mainstreamed education is still in an experimental phase. We don't know how effective it is. We don't have any standard information about it just yet. In my first study, it was indicated that even if you have the best interpreter, somebody who is a native signer, somebody who has an EIPA skill level score of 5.0, somebody who is a CICT, deaf students are still missing out information via that interpreted instruction. And when schools hire interpreters with even less skill and less knowledge, imagine how much more students are missing out because of that. The field of interpreting is still having a healthy debate about exactly what the roles and responsibilities of educational interpreters are. Is it just to interpret what the teacher says? Or is it that sometimes interpreters have to step out of their role and sometimes become more of a tutor? And there's a great deal of healthy discussion going on to that. The research has only started maybe 10 or 15 years ago, so we're still working through those issues. In summary, what I would like to say is that it's not the kids that fail. It's the educational system that fails. We need to work with the educational system in order to ensure that our students are successful. I don't know if you're familiar with the tripod model. Often I've seen educational interpreters who are willing to work with the teacher but leave out the student. They don't realize that the student is their consumer and that it's important that all three of those components, the teacher, the deaf student, and the interpreter, are involved in the education of that student. Because if you're missing one of those legs of that tripod, it falls down. So it's really important to include the deaf student as part of the learning team. This is just a moment. This is a framework providing the foundation to ensure effective education. You can read more detail about this in the book. I know time is running short, so I'd like to get through some other parts of my presentation. As I said, my study was the first study to be done in any K-12 environment. I encourage those who are asking for research topics to please replicate my study. Perhaps they could use a different subject matter, for example, history or math. I did science, but it might be worthwhile to study different subject matters. Perhaps they could replicate my study but use high school students or elementary age students, preschool students. There's a wide range of ages. I did middle school. Somebody else can try one of the other age groups. They could replicate my study and use CDIs in the interpreting process and see how CDIs perform as compared to their hearing interpreter peers. So that's something to think about for future studies as well. Another study could be that the instruction is not only via the interpreter, but also through written materials, PowerPoints. Will deaf students' understanding of the content provided in that lesson increase when they are provided with some other written materials? So these are some thoughts about potential future studies that other people can take on. I would like to thank the Deaf Studies Lab from RIT for their support with this research.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's quite fascinating. There's a lot that still needed to be studied. So at this point in time, we'd like to open it up for questions and thoughts and comments from our audience members, and we will ask you to come to the front of the room, to stand here on stage to ask your question, and to have your dialogue with Dr. Kim Kurtz. So are there any questions at this time? Then please come forward. Hello, and thank you for coming. And thank you for all of this wonderful information. You know, my question, and if I remember correctly, is that you said that most of the students who are deaf, growing up, they understood interpreters better and the context better because of the fact that they had parents that aided with their learning. But if I understand correctly, most deaf individuals are born to hearing parents. So that means that about 5% of those are born to deaf parents. The other 95% are born to those who have hearing parents. So what do we do with the 95%? How can we help them to achieve a certain level and to be on par with the rest of their peers?
Wow, that's a wonderful question and definitely well thought out. Thank you. Hey, please, come up here with me. That's a wonderful question. My research showed that deaf of hearing students will do better via direct communication, direct instruction, but you're asking me who are the best candidates for interpreting, and I would say deaf of deaf. Deaf of hearing, I would say, must be in direct communication environments. And I know when we're talking about 95% of those students, we don't have standard assessments or any types of evaluation that can assess students' comprehension, knowledge, language skills, as far as whether or not they would make a good candidate for a particular kind of environment. Unfortunately, we don't have those sorts of tests available to us today. But we can't just assume that just because somebody can sign, we're going to put them we're going to let them be an interpreter, and just because a deaf student is a deaf student, they need to be in an interpreted situation or a direct instruction situation. We need to work together, to collaborate, to also work within the educational system to develop better information. We also found that a bachelor's degree is not enough. They need to actually have a great deal of knowledge in a content area. But if I were assessing a student who was deaf of hearing and they weren't doing well in an interpreted situation, then I would recommend that they were moved over to a situation in which the instruction was provided directly via ASL. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, your presentation gave me chills. It's just great. There's not a lot of studies that are out there that look at the K through 12 population, so I'm so happy that you did that. So my first thought is that you used an interpreter who had the 5.0, and there are not many that are out there that have that qualification. You said there are only 200.
Right.
And there are many more who have below a 5.0. And that shows that there are several deaf students that are failing in it. And I like the quote that you had used. It wasn't the deaf student or the kids that are failing, it's a system that does. And so I think that this study needs to be further replicated. Second, my question is, how do you test deaf students and their fluency with the language? Because you said that you screen them out based on their lack of fluency.
That's a wonderful question as well. I would interview the different students. I have a certification in doing ASLPI assessments. I didn't use that particular assessment because I didn't want the students to be uncomfortable, but I would have a one-on-one conversation with them. I would have them watch a video that was about 5 minutes in length and ask them questions about the video, and if I felt that there was far too much misunderstanding or that they weren't able to sign very clearly themselves, then I would eliminate them from my study. I also would speak with the principal and the teachers in general to find out whether or not they were a good student and received good grades. I wanted to ensure that I had the best candidates for my study, because if it's a student who's already struggling in their subject matter areas, then it didn't make sense to actually include them in my study, because there might have been other factors contributing to their not understanding the material. So I also had to make sure that I got permission from the parents and the teachers and the principal. And getting into a K-12 system was a wonderful idea, but it was incredibly tough, especially in today's world when we're having more and more strict regulations or more paperwork that's required from parents, teachers, principals. I was able to explain my intention to the different schools, and they were very welcoming and open to that as far as the deaf schools go. But the mainstream programs, it was much harder to convince them to allow me to come in. I reached out to several mainstream programs and was turned down by several of them. And I think that perhaps they were afraid that my study might show that they weren't as effective. I did develop a great relationship with 2 or 3 mainstream programs in schools, and they allowed me to come in and do my work there. But what was even worse was dealing with the students, the hearing parents of the deaf students in mainstream programs. They did not want their students to be part of my study. I would explain my study to them, but it was challenging. It was like pulling teeth to try and convince these parents and some of these schools to allow me to get in and do my work there. I'm hoping that my study will open more doors for future studies. And does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, but it does tie into something else that made me think of this. You know, with your study being replicated in the different ways in which you can do that. I actually work with the K through 12 population myself, but what's your advice for those who want to study a K through 12 population, how to reduce the feeling of having to pull teeth? So what would be your advice or your recommendations surrounding that? And then it's interesting because with your study you use deaf students who I guess were considered to be the deaf students that were performing based on their grades. So then when we look at the average deaf student, you were looking at the cream of the crop and how they were performing. So it's not necessarily looking at the overall average. So again, what would your advice be for doing a K through 12 study after having doing so if people want to further replicate this?
I could take somebody out for coffee. I think really networking. It's just sometimes, and also taking others out for coffee, networking with the different individuals, the different school administrators. I think that's often the best option. Administrators and school officials often get a lot of emails from researchers, and they don't know who these individuals are who are emailing them. I think if you reach out in person, you know, take them out for coffee, have a short conversation, chat with them. I think getting to know people on a one-on-one basis, that helps you to build a relationship, and that's key. And that will help you get in the door. It doesn't always work, but that's my advice. Try to get in with the school administrators, get to know them.
You're right with the networking comment. Thank you. Come on up. Give me just 1 second, though. So while I was waiting for Annie to come to the stage, I just wanted to quickly ask you about your own perspective, a little bit different from your study, but what's your own personal perspective about bilingual education for deaf students, and how do you feel that that's going so far? What's happening out in the classrooms, and what's the benefit that you see, or what are the trends that you see happening? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. My study didn't entail bilingual education, but I do see advantages of bilingual education. Children who are learning in both their L1 and L2 and acquiring both at the same time. There's a great deal of research that shows that children who learn an L1 early on, before the 9 months of age, before 1, 2, or 3, they talk about the critical period theory. But I definitely advocate starting as young as you can, starting early, so that they become more proficient, more creative, more effective, more able to go back and forth between the two languages to read and write, being able to go back and forth between ASL and written English. I think it's wonderful. It's very important for students to be raised, or for kids to be raised in bilingual environments.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. I really found it fascinating to look at your results from your research, at the same time thinking about having a second type of mediated instruction for deaf students who in some schools are adding VRI, video remote interpreting, within the classroom. I know that there are many colleges that are starting to use that nowadays. In the K through 12 setting, I'm not sure how many are using that. I know that there are several places that are interested for a variety of reasons. Some places financially, and some places because the lack of qualified interpreters. So the whole time that I was watching your presentation, I was thinking about the technical aspect of this and how technology has had an impact on education in general, as well as interpreted education. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are about that. Do you think that video remote interpreting compared to direct instruction, as it relates to interpreted face-to-face interactions, do you think that that's different? And I guess, are there critiques to that? How do we actually research that, and what are your thoughts about VRI?
Great, so you're talking about 3 different environments: direct instruction, interpreted instruction, and then VRI instruction. What about video with direct instruction? You're just talking about interpreters via video remote interpreting?
Right, the teacher would be in the room and the interpreter would be on the screen.
That would be a great replicated study. I'm not actually able to answer that question just yet because I haven't done any work with VRI. But there's more and more technology these days. They're utilizing video remote interpreting more and more. Again, I think that what's key is to look at the interpreting skills of the interpreter more so than the technological capabilities. My study showed that language is far more important than anything, far more important than experience with interpreters, technological experience. What about you? Why don't you try and study that? It might be a good study for you to take on.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Please come forward. your presentation was wonderful. It made a big impact on me. I'm hard of hearing. Or I grew up hard of hearing and later lost my hearing. But in 1978, that was the first time that I had an interpreter. Before that, I was in a special ed classroom. And so I was the interpreter who was in the classroom was one who learned sign language from church. And I didn't have my parents there to support me. I really didn't know how to advocate for myself. The principal said that that was better than nothing. So I've come a long way, and I've seen a lot of changes happen. So I thank you for doing this research.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. You see that her story is quite common. People read my study and come up to me and share their own experiences growing up and how they had to get by either with no interpreter or a less skilled interpreter. I think it's time to stop, right? Well, it's time to look and see what works and open up this academic dialogue and see what's happening in our educational system today. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
So if there are no further questions or comments, then I think we can close this session. Thank you very much for this emotional but very important topic. I know that this is important for so many of us, and we want to be able to do the right thing as interpreters and figure out how we can work with the law, with deaf parents, and the community to provide the appropriate support.
I would like to, do I have time? Great. I would like to add that it's important. Remember, earlier in my communication, I talked about how the deaf community kept approaching me and asking me why it is that I would even do this research, because they already knew the answer. But I said that I wanted to find out, I wanted to have proof as to what was actually occurring out there and what the percentage increase was. And what we need to remember is that research leads to policy, which leads to law. And I've had lawyers contact me from time to time using my study in their court cases, in their special ed court cases. In the state of California, there's one lawyer who contacted me who's fighting in the courts for provision of an interpreter for a student, and so I shared my research, what I gained from the work that I did. So I think that research can have a positive impact on judgments that occur, on decisions that could lead to policy, and then eventually perhaps law. And I think often people don't realize that research can have such a huge impact on social policy. Thank you.
And again, thank you. And before we close, I'd just like to give you something small from our department, a token of our appreciation, and representing the rest of the world who's joined us today.
Thank you. Oh, that's so touching. Thank you. I didn't expect that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do appreciate that. I appreciate being here. It's been a wonderful past couple of days interacting with the students. It's just been great. So,
thank you again. I want to remind you that our next lecture series will be Dr. Keith Cagle, who'll be talking for a length of time, talking about how long certain signs have been around and existed here in the world. That will be October 24th, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And with that, thank you again, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.